Southend-on-Sea, Essex, August 1956, Tuesday morning, just past 10. Frank Ashworth, 61, a retired schoolteacher from Bradford, was standing at the entrance to Southend Pier with the specific posture of a man about to do something he considered worthwhile. He had the admission ticket in his hand. He had walked down from the seafront hotels. He had been to Southend once before, 12 years earlier, in 1944, when the pier had been HMS Lee and was closed to the public and guarded and directed wartime shipping rather than summer visitors. He had thought about the pier on and off since then. He was here now because the pier had a specific quality that no other pier in Britain shared. It extended 1.33 miles into the Thames Estuary, a mile and a third of timber and iron above the water. More than 7,000 feet from the shore to the pier head. It was the longest pleasure pier in the world. It had been the longest pleasure pier in the world since its extension was completed in January 1898, when it reached 7,080 feet and overtook every other pier on every other coastline. He had not come to Southend to walk the longest pier in the world as a record-breaking exercise. He had come because of what a mile and a third above the sea would give him that no other arrangement of land and water in Britain could provide. After 10 minutes of walking the pier deck, the town behind him would be small. After 20 minutes, it would be a backdrop. After 30 minutes, he would be standing above the Thames Estuary with Essex behind him and Kent across the water and the horizon ahead, and the timber beneath his feet and the iron around him would be the only thing between him and the sea in all directions. The pier train, Southend Pier, Railway's first pier railway in the country, electric since 1890, passed him on its way to the pier head. He waved it by. He was walking. What Frank Ashworth was doing when he paid his admission at the Southend Pier entrance on a Tuesday morning in August 1956, and what the pier gave him that no other structure on the British coast could replicate, is what this video is about before you can understand what Southend Pier gave Frank Ashworth in August 1956, and what any pier gave any visitor at any point in the preceding century. You need to understand where the pier came from and what problem it was built to solve. The first pleasure pier in Britain opened at Ryde on the Isle of Wight on 26 July 1814. It was built by John Kent of Southampton, 1,740 feet long, wooden, with piles driven into the mud of the Solent. Its purpose was practical. Ryde sits on the Isle of Wight at a point where the beach becomes a vast expanse of mudflat at low tide, and before the pier existed, passengers arriving by ferry from the mainland had to be transferred to a rowing boat at low water, carried across wet sand by porters, or wait for the tide to permit their boat to reach the shore. A pier extending far enough into the water for ships to dock at all tidal states solved this problem. It also, incidentally, created a walkway above the sea that people immediately discovered they wanted to use for its own sake. The 1826 Guide to the Isle of Wight described the new pier as offering the visitor a chance to inhale the sea breeze and to pass, hour after hour, without being sensible how rapidly time is gliding away. The pier as transport infrastructure had accidentally produced the pier as social institution. What followed over the next 70 years was one of the most concentrated episodes of single-purpose building in British history. By 1850, a dozen piers stood at British seaside resorts. During the 1860s, more than 20 piers were begun. During the 1870s, another 20. The 1871 Bank Holidays Act, introduced by the Liberal politician Sir John Lubbock, gave British workers the right to 4 public holidays annually, and every pier company in Britain understood what this meant. More feet on their decking, more pennies at their turnstiles, more profits for their shareholders. It was not only the number of piers that mattered, but their character. The pier of 1814 had been a wooden landing stage. The pier of 1870 was something different, an iron structure with pavilions, bandstands, reading rooms, refreshment kiosks, and a theatre at its seaward end, a complete entertainment venue suspended above the sea. The transformation from transport infrastructure to social institution had not been accidental. It had been engineered most extensively by one man. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the British seaside holiday between 1920 and 1980. Not nostalgia for deck chairs. The documented social meaning of a ritual that a generation of British families arranged their working year around. What a pier gave a visitor that the promenade was not entertainment in the ordinary sense. It was a specific physical experience, the only one the British seaside offered, of standing above the moving sea on a structure that had no reason to exist except to put you there. And if you walked the piers, put it in the comments. Southend or Blackpool or Brighton or Eastbourne or somewhere else entirely. What did it feel like to walk out above the sea until the shore behind you was small? Next time, the package holiday and the day Britain chose Spain, back on the pier. The man most responsible for what the Victorian pleasure pier became was Eugenius Birch, born in London on 20 June 1818, the son of a Middlesex magistrate, trained as a civil engineer, and by the mid-1850s, the most sought-after pier designer in Britain. He would eventually design 14 piers across the British coast, a body of work that no other engineer came close to matching, and that defined, for a generation, what a pier looked like and what it could do. His first pier was at Margate in 1855. It was a commission born of necessity. The town needed a replacement for its deteriorating wooden jetty, and the pier committee had received 15 proposals. Birch's was chosen unanimously. His contribution was technical, but its consequences were social. Where earlier piers had used wooden piles, vulnerable to decay, marine worm, and the continuous stress of the sea, Birch used iron screw piles, a method patented by the blind Irish engineer Alexander Mitchell. Iron screw piles could be driven deeper into the seabed, giving the structure a stability that timber could not match. The resulting pier was thinner and visually more delicate than its wooden predecessors, yet structurally stronger. The Brighton Gazette, reporting on his work in 1866, described him as looked upon as the first engineer in England for sea works of this description. His best-known pier was Brighton's West Pier, opened in 1866. At its peak in 1919, it attracted 2,074,000 paying visitors. At its seaward end, Birch had widened the deck to create a large open space at whose four corners were octagonal houses, separate ladies' and gentlemen's lounging and refreshment rooms. The pierhead was a destination within the destination. You walked from the shore to the pierhead and found, at the end of the walk, a small complex of buildings above the open sea. His Blackpool North Pier, opened in May 1863, is the oldest intact pier in the United Kingdom. His Eastbourne Pier, opened in 1870, would be described a century later as among the finest in Britain. His Hastings Pier opened on the first ever August bank holiday in 1872, the first bank holiday nationally, the first major pier opening to coincide with it. During the 1860s and 1870s, an average of 2 piers were built every year somewhere on the British coast. By the end of the 19th century, approximately 100 pleasure piers pinned Britain's coastline. By 1890, Blackpool's Central Pier was recording approximately 1 million visitors annually. The pier had become, in the 40 years since Ryde's wooden landing stage of 1814, the defining architecture of the British seaside. What the iron pier specifically gave a visitor that the wooden jetty could not, and why the social institution it produced was inseparable from the engineering that made it possible, is the question this block carries forward. Frank Ashworth, at the 20-minute mark of his walk along Southend Pier, stopped and looked back toward the shore. Southend was visible, but small a row of buildings along a low coastline, set well back from his position. He looked forward toward the pierhead, still some distance ahead. He looked to his left and to his right, at the Thames Estuary on both sides of the pier deck. He was surrounded by water in 3 directions. This was the specific experience that the pier, and only the pier, provided. Not the promenade walk, which moved along the shoreline with the town always to one side and the sea to the other. Not the beach, which placed you at the edge of the sea but not above it. Not the cliff walk, which elevated you above the sea without placing you in it. The pier extended from the land into the sea at sea level. suspending its visitors above the water on a structure of iron and timber that acknowledged, in its very construction, that the sea was below and around it, and had to be contended with rather than ignored. What this produced in the visitor, the specific quality of the pier experience documented across generations of pier walkers, was a transformation in their relationship to the land they had left. After 10 minutes on the pier, you were not on the promenade with the sea on one side. You were above the sea, with the land retreating behind you. After 20 minutes, the land was no longer the context. The sea was. This mattered because it was the one experience the British seaside uniquely offered that no inland geography could replicate. You could walk in the Lake District and feel surrounded by landscape. You could climb a hill and see a long way. But you could not, except on a pier, stand above moving water on a clear structure with the sky and the sea in every direction, and the land visible behind you as something you had left rather than something you were inhabiting. The longer the pier, the more complete the experience. Southend's 1.33 miles gave it a completeness that a 500-foot pier could not achieve. After half a mile above the Thames Estuary, the specific quality of the pier walk, the transformation from land person to sea person, was no longer incipient. It was fully arrived. What Frank Ashworth understood, standing at the midpoint of Southend Pier with Essex behind him and Kent across the water, was not something he could have articulated precisely. But he had come here from Bradford in August 1956 specifically to stand in this position, and the fact of being here, above the sea, at the midpoint of the world's longest pier, was sufficient justification for the journey. Blackpool built 3 piers, and each of the 3 was a different social world. Blackpool North Pier, Eugenius Birch's first major pier, opened in May 1863. It was conceived as a promenade pier, quiet, refined, oriented toward the middle-class visitor who came to Blackpool for a week and expected something different from the working-class day tripper. By the 1870s, its Indian pavilion had given the pier a distinctive architectural identity and an entertainment provision, orchestral concerts, military bands, that was calibrated to its social register. The North Pier was where you went to listen, to promenade, to be seen at the appropriate pace. Blackpool Central Pier, opened in 1868, was a different kind of institution. Its target was the day tripper rather than the week stayer, the working-class Lancashire visitor who had come for the day on the excursion train and needed dancing rather than concerts. By 1890, its open-air dancing platform was drawing approximately 1 million visitors annually. 1 million people in 1 year, going to one pier in one town to dance above the Irish Sea. Blackpool South Pier, opened in 1893, was different again, an amusement pier, with rides and funfair attractions orientated toward a family audience rather than the dancing couples of the Central Pier or the promenading concert-goers of the North Pier. 3 piers, half a mile apart along the same seafront, each with a distinct social function, each with a distinct audience. This was the pier system at its most developed. A town that understood what its visitors needed had provided 3 separate answers to the same question. What do you do when you have been deposited by the railway at Blackpool and you need to organize your time above the sea? And arrange those answers along the same promenade, so that the working-class day tripper who wanted to dance went to the Central Pier, the middle-class week stayer who wanted to listen went to the North Pier, and the family with children who wanted rides went to the South Pier, and none of them had to encounter a venue that was not designed for them. Today, only Blackpool still has all 3 piers. The other British resorts that built multiple piers have lost 1 or more of them. Brighton built 2, 1 is gone. Bournemouth built 2, 1 is reduced. Blackpool's 3 survive as the most complete example of the Victorian pier social system. On 13 May 1940, a Royal Engineers Field Company based at Robertsbridge compiled a report on the East Sussex piers, Eastbourne, St Leonard's and Hastings. 2 days later, orders were issued to proceed with partial demolition of all of them. The reason was simple. In the event of a German invasion, the piers could be used as landing stages for troops and supplies. A pier that had spent 70 years making it easier for visitors to reach the sea could, in specific wartime circumstances, make it easier for an enemy army to reach England. The piers were therefore sectioned, lengths of decking removed or blown up to break the structures and deny them to any invading force. The sectioning of Britain's piers in 1940 was not universal, but it was widespread. Many piers on the east and south coast were breached. Southend Pier, the longest in the world, was taken over by the Royal Navy and renamed HMS Lee. It directed convoys rather than summer visitors. Piers that were not sectioned were closed, requisitioned, or converted to military use. Brighton's Palace Pier was breached. Eastbourne's pier had sections of its timber decking removed. Some piers that were sectioned or damaged never reopened. The cost of reconstruction exceeded what the post-war visitor economy could sustain. The post-war pier culture was therefore operating in a landscape that had been partially thinned by the wartime damage. Piers that had reopened by the late 1940s had done so after years of neglect and wartime use that had accelerated their deterioration. Southend Pier, reopening after the war, attracted nearly 6 million visitors in 1949, exceeding its pre-war visitor numbers. The post-war demand for the specific experience of the pier was not in question. The condition of the structures that provided it was. The 1950s saw the piers at their post-war peak, repaired, populated, performing their social functions. The entertainment provision was there. Southend's Dolphin Cafe and Sun Deck Theatre opened during the decade. The visitors were there. Brighton's Palace Pier, Blackpool's 3 piers, Southend, all recording substantial visitor numbers. What was also there, invisible in the summer crowds, was the structural deterioration that would begin to manifest itself in fires, closures, and collapses from the late 1950s onward. Brighton's West Pier, 1866, Eugenius Birch's masterwork, 2 million visitors in 1919, closed 1975. Fires 2003, effectively lost. Hastings Pier, opened 1872. Fire 2010, restored with lottery funding 2016. The restoration won the RIBA Sterling Prize for Architecture. These are not outliers. They are the documented pattern of the British pleasure pier's relationship with the sea, the weather, and the economics of maintaining a Victorian iron structure without a Victorian economy to support it. At the beginning of the 20th century, approximately 100 pleasure piers stood on Britain's coastline. At the beginning of the 21st century, approximately 50 remain. The 100 years between those 2 points had been a catalogue of fire, storm, wartime damage, deferred maintenance, and the economic pressure of maintaining Victorian iron structures in the sea without the Victorian economy that had built them. The National Piers Society was founded in 1979, under Sir John Betjeman as its first honorary president, at a time when some of the finest piers were threatened with demolition. Betjeman, who had written about Southend Pier, who had said, "The pier is Southend is the pier," understood what the pier meant as a social institution and as an architectural one. The NPS became, across the following decades, the organization that lobbied for the pier's preservation and sometimes succeeded. Piers that would otherwise have been demolished remain because of the society's advocacy. What the package holiday, the car, and the charter flight did to the pier was not to destroy it in the way that a fire or a storm destroys a pier. It did something more gradual and in some ways more comprehensive. It reduced the visitor numbers that had always been the pier's commercial justification, which reduced the maintenance budgets, which accelerated the deterioration, which produced the fires and closures, and collapses that the visitor decline had already set in motion by removing the commercial margin that might have prevented them. But the pier did not disappear. Approximately 50 British pleasure piers survive. Southend's is still 1.33 miles long. Blackpool still has 3. Brighton's Palace Pier records more than 3 million visitors annually. Hastings Pier was restored and won the RIBA Sterling Prize. The experience of paying admission, walking above the sea, watching the shore recede, and standing at the pierhead with water in 3 directions is available in 2026 to anyone who travels to a British seaside resort and turns toward the sea rather than the town. What the pier gave Frank Ashworth in August 1956, at the midpoint of the world's longest pleasure pier, is available to whoever makes the same walk today. The scale is the same. The sea is the same. The specific experience of standing above moving water on a structure that has no reason to exist except to put you there, that is still there. If this channel is going to keep documenting what the British seaside meant to the people who made it there 1 week, subscribe. There are more resorts, more promenades, more boarding houses, and more pier walks that were the best hour of someone's year, and were never described as such because they didn't need to be. What a pier gave a visitor that the promenade was not entertainment in the ordinary sense. It was a specific physical experience, the only one the British seaside offered, of standing above the moving sea on a structure that had no reason to exist except to put you there. The package hotel in Spain did not offer this. It offered something else. And if you walked the piers, put it in the comments. Southend or Blackpool or Brighton or Eastbourne or somewhere else entirely. What did it feel like to walk out above the sea until the shore behind you was small? Next time, the package holiday and the day Britain chose Spain. Frank Ashworth walked the full 1.33 miles to the Southend Pier head on Tuesday morning. He stood there for 20 minutes with Essex behind him and Kent across the water and the horizon ahead. He took the train back. He had been here in 1944 when the pier was HMS Lee. He came back in 1956 because the pier had been returned to the public and he had been waiting. What HMS Lee had been, a convoy control center. What Southend Pier was, the longest pleasure pier in the world, available to anyone who paid the admission at the turnstile. What the pier head gave Frank Ashworth, Essex behind him, Kent across the water, the horizon ahead. No reason to be there except the walk above the sea that had brought him there. The pier had known what to do with 1 mile and 1/3 above the Thames Estuary. Majorca had not been built to ask what standing above moving water, with the shore small behind you, was